This is a really fun project. We're going to be building out a complete Pictionary clone with multiplayer and pretty much everything you need to have a Pictionary or a drawing style application. And it's going to incorporate a ton of concepts on not only the front end, but also we're going to be building a server for the back end of our application, which is something we haven't touched until now. So we're going to be using Node alongside front end JavaScript together to make this project. Also, this is a great project because there's tons of ways that you can expand upon this project, which makes it a great project for learning and improving your skills. Also, before we get started, you'll notice I don't have my webcam on for this video. Again, this is because we have a bunch of stuff that's going to be happening in this bottom right-hand corner, and I don't want my face to be covering any of it. So to get started, I have two windows of the application open. This is the final version of what we're going to build, and we can type in any room name we want, for example, test, and we're going to give ourselves a name. We'll say Bob, and let's create that room. Then over here, we enter the same exact room ID. We enter a new name, so we can have Jill over here, create the room. And now we have two Pictionary rooms side by side. And once we click the ready button for both people, you can see that it started up. And the person on the right-hand side has the word dog that they need to build out and draw. And the person on the left has the ability to guess, and it's going to show up on both sides, both screens. So if I, for example, start drawing, you're going to notice anything I draw on the right is showing up on the left as well. So our server is communicating with both sides of the browser. You could imagine that this left browser is someone else somewhere entirely different in the world. This could be someone, for example, in Russia. This person on the right-hand side could be in the US, and it's still going to work just fine. So we can do a beautiful drawing of a dog. As you can tell, this is clearly a dog. And this person comes over here, guesses dog, and you can see Bob is the winner. And then we click ready up again. And now, again, this person on the right just randomly got chosen, but they got the word bike. We draw this and so on. This person can guess, and it continues on like that. Now, to get started, we obviously don't have all of this amazing code. All we have are the styles. So we have our base index HTML. We can type in a room ID and a name, hit enter, and it'll bring us to this room page, but right now we can't draw. None of the buttons actually do anything, so our application really doesn't do anything at all up to this point. And the only reason that this form works is because if we go to our index.html, our action just directs us to that room.html, and we're using the method get. That is why up here, you can see we have the room ID and the name inside of the URL, which is going to be useful for when we want to connect with the server. So to get started with this application, I really want to focus on how we are going to build out our project and what is the overall high level of our project. Because like I said, we're going to need a server that communicates between the different browsers. Because when you connect your computer, you're not going to connect directly to the other person in the game. You're going to connect to some global server which communicates between both of the people in the game at the same time and across the different rooms. And the best way to do real-time communication in the browser with Node is going to be something called Socket.io, which is a library that we're going to use heavily in this project, especially to build out our server. Because all our server does is make sure that the communication happens between our different clients without them having to directly connect to one another. And Socket.io is a fairly easy library to get working with. We're going to be using version 3.0 in this project. And if for some reason in the future this gets updated to version 4 or 5 and it doesn't work, you can manually install version 3 or just go through the documentation like I'll show you in this project and you can make the appropriate changes. But I highly doubt anything is going to change in future versions because we're using very basic components of Socket.io and we're not doing anything crazy. So with a lot of talking done, the very first thing I want to do is just set up our application to have a client and a server portion. So what we can do is just create some new folders. We're going to create a folder called client, and we're also going to create a folder called server. So client is going to be where all of our front end lies. So let's just drag our front end code up in there. That's our HTML, CSS, JavaScript, pretty much everything in our application will be here. The server is going to be just for the part that communicates between the different clients. And the reason we're doing these in separate folders is because the client, I could upload anywhere. I could run the client on www.pictionary.com. The server, on the other hand, I could run somewhere else. I could run it on pictionaryserver.com, for example, or whatever. I could even run it on the same pictionary.com if I wanted, but in this case, you kind of think about it where the server is in a different location than the client, and a lot of times this is how your applications are going to be set up, and it makes this just a lot easier to work with. So we have our client in one side and our server in the other side. And what I want to do is I want to set up our client to actually be using Parcel. That way we can do imports. So inside of the client, we need to get into that folder to run our npm commands. So if we open up our terminal, when we first open it, we're going to be at our root folder. If we type in ls, for example, you can see that it says the client and the server are the two folders that we have inside of this folder that we're currently in. So what we need to do is actually go inside of the client folder. There's a few ways we can do that. One is by right-clicking here and clicking Open in Terminal. That'll open a new terminal window inside of that client folder. If we type ls, you can see the files inside that folder. Or another way you can do it is if you just type cd and then type in client, that'll move us into the client folder. Either way works. Whatever one you want to do is perfectly fine. Once we're in that folder though, all we need to do is initialize npm. So we'll do npm init-y. Once we have that initialized, the next thing that we need to do is install that parcel bundler. So npm i --save dev parcel bundler. There we go. I'm going to shrink down this over here on the side of my screen. The next thing we need to do is inside of our server, we need to essentially initialize another npm repository. And so to do that, we could create a new terminal here by clicking the plus button. But what I want to do is just click this little button next to it, which splits our terminals side by side. It's a little bit crunched for space, but that way we can have both our client and server running at the same time side by side instead of having to switch through tabs. So once we have this ready like this, we can go to our server by just doing cd server. We click ls, you can see there's nothing inside of our server right now, so we're in the right folder. Then we can just run npm init-y. And hopefully inside of our server, we should see a package.json file. Then what we can do is install socket.io. So if we just go to the socket.io documentation, we just expand this a little bit, you should see up here in this learn category, we have a get started. If we just click on get started, you can see all of the getting started documentation. If we just scroll down here a ways, you can see this is for setting it up with an Express server. We're not going to be really worrying about an Express server. So instead what I want to do is just go to the documentation. And here we have the server, which is what we're working on. So I'm going to go to installation of the server. And you can see we just run npm install socket.io. And if for some reason in the future the version you're using doesn't work, you can specify a manual version here, which in my case is 3.0.4. That's the version I'm using for this project. So let's just copy this command and make this a little bit bigger. We'll paste it into our server side. So we can run that. It should run pretty quickly. And now in our package.json, you can see socket.io is one of our dependencies. Also, I want to install a dependency called nodemon. This allows us to automatically restart our node application instead of having to manually shut it down and restart it every time we make changes. So npm i --save dev nodemon. There we go. And that should install nodemon for us. And up here, it looks like parcel bundler did finish installing. So let's just make sure inside of our client that we set up our start script, which is just going to run parcel index.html and room.html, since we have both those files. And then we need to have our build script, and our build script is just going to say parcel build index.html and room.html. Now inside of our server, let's just create a file. We'll call it server.js. This is where all of our server code is going to go. We're just going to put console log I in here for now so we can see if this works. And we need to, inside of our package.json for our server, set up the start scripts as well. So for start, we're just going to have here, this is going to run node server.js. And then for development, we're going to create a script called dev start. And this is just going to run nodemon server.js. Essentially, the difference between these is start is going to run it with node, and it means that our application is not going to automatically refresh when we make changes, while when we're developing with nodemon, every time we make a change, our server will automatically refresh itself. So to show you how that works, we can run npm start, and if that goes for a little bit, you can see it prints out hi right here because it's running node server. If we do npm run dev start, which is this command right here, you can see it still prints out hi, and then you can see that it's starting the node server and it's waiting for changes. So if we go into our server and we say hi2 and save, you can see it refreshes and prints out hi2. So our server automatically listens for changes and refreshes itself in development, which is really useful. Now I'm just going to expand this section a little bit so we can really see the server side of things, because that's what we're going to be focusing on first, is just getting a very basic server up and running with socket.io by reading the documentation to see what needs to happen. So if we just scroll down a little ways, we can keep going, and you can see here is essentially a basic way to set up a socket.io, but I want to see all of the details of how we set up socket.io. So if I scroll to the top here and just expand out my page so I get the sidebar, you can see we have installation and then initialization. Initialization is essentially like the startup, how you get your server initialized. So I want to see all the different ways we can initialize the server. And you can see we have a bunch of different ways. We have this way with this HTTP server, same thing down here, same thing here. We have a standalone version, which means you don't need to worry about anything else. This is the way we're going to go because our server only is socket.io. It doesn't have any other, things with it. So this is the way we're going to go with. And as you can see, there's other ways that you can do this as well. But for our use case, all we care about is the standalone installation because we just want to get our server running with Socket.io. You can see there's a couple ways to do it. One is by passing the port in here, and the other one is by using io.listen. In our case, I'm just going to copy this code over to our server, get rid of this options object because we don't really need to worry about that. And then down here, this is going to be whenever our IO successfully connects, we need to do some code inside of here. So what I want to do is just console.log here. And if we save this, you're going to notice nothing gets printed out. And the reason for that is that this on connection gets run every single time a browser connects to our Socket.io instance. So the next step essentially is to connect our browser, our client, to our server. And that's what's going to run this IO on connection. And then all of our code is going to go inside of here. But for now, we essentially have our server running and it's listening and it's waiting for clients to connect. But our client right now doesn't have any JavaScript, so it doesn't connect at all. So now the next step, like I mentioned, is to move on to the client. And the very first thing I want to do with our client is just get it connected to Socket.io on our server. Because from there, we can build out the entire application. But until we connect to our server, we have no way to communicate between browsers. So again, let me just minimize this, go over to the Socket.io documentation, and there's a section here for installation for the client. So I want to click on that. And you can see it has compatibility notes as well as how you can install it. And there's a few different ways you can install Socket.io. There's the standalone build, because by default, your server is going to expose its own Socket.io JS that you can use. But since our server is separate from our client, I'd rather not use this technique. We scroll down, we have the CDN technique. I generally don't like using a CDN because it's hard to update and maintain the versions of your files since they're hard-coded in your HTML. And then finally, down here is the way we're going to use, which is npm, because our entire application is using npm already, so we might as well just use it for Socket.io. So let's just copy this command over, come over here, expand out our client section, and let's just paste in that command. That's going to install Socket.io on our client. And if we go to our client section in the package.json, you can see we have Socket.io as a dependency. Next thing I want to do is look at how we can connect our client to Socket.io. So initialization is the documentation we need. So here it's talking about making sure it's imported. And then once it's imported, this is essentially all you need to do to get Socket.io into your project. You just import IO from that client. So we can copy this code. And then what we need to do inside of our client is create a JavaScript file. It's going to be for our room. So we'll just call this room.js. And inside of here, we're going to get our IO instance just like this. Now, if we go back to the documentation, you can see that it says from the same domain. So if your front end, your client, is served on the same domain as your server, you can just call IO and not pass it a URL. But in our case, our server is at a different location than our client is. They're both running in two different locations. Right now, our server is set up to run on port 3000, and by default, Parcel runs on port 1234. So they're different from one another, which means we need to pass a URL in. If we just scroll down a little ways, you can see here from a different domain, it says you need to pass the domain name in to your IO. So what we can do on the client, go to our room.js, we can just say const socket is equal to IO, and we need to pass it in the URL to our server. And our server URL is just HTTP, and then we have localhost, because this is running on localhost, port 3000. That is the path to our server. And if we come in here, console.log socket, and if we come into our room.html, we make sure that we import that script. So we have our script, which has a source of room.js, and it's going to be deferred. And there we go. Now all we need to do is make sure that we actually run this with Parcel. So we can just say npm start. That's going to run our Parcel, get everything running on localhost 1234. And I just minimize this a little bit, and I click on this, you're going to notice immediately we get an error. And it may be really confusing that localhost can't find your page. This is really just a little bit of a peculiarity with how Parcel runs. All we need to do is up here, put in index.html, and then it's going to find your actual page. This is only in development that you have to worry about this, but it's something that you're probably going to run into. So just make sure you put in index.html if you see that error. Now we can enter a room name. We can enter our name, hit enter. You can see our room and name are up here. And right now, if we inspect, we should have something printed into the console. And of course, we get a bunch of errors printed out of the console, not quite what we're looking for. So let's scroll to the top. You can see our socket here is saying the connected is false, disconnected is true, so it's clearly not working. And you can see here, we have blocked by CORS policy, no access control allowed. This is essentially saying that we're trying to communicate with our server, but we're communicating from a different URL. We're on port 1234, our server's on port 3000, so it's blocking those requests. It's saying I only want to allow requests from specific URLs. And we need to tell it what those URLs are, because right now, the only URL that our server listens to is its own URL. So we need to tell it, hey, you know what? You can listen to our client, which is on localhost 1234. To do that, we just need to pass an option to this socket.io function here. So we can come in here, use an option that we pass to this, and we're going to pass it a cores option. This cores options takes an object, and this object takes an origin. And this origin is just the URL of your place. So in our case, it's our client, which is HTTP. And we got to go to localhost 1234. Now you can see automatically over here, our server restarted itself, and it even printed out here. And that's because our socket actually connected. So if we just refresh our page, you can see it prints here. And if we inspect, we should have a socket, as you can see, that's connected true, disconnected false. So now we have a socket we can use to actually communicate with our server. And this here being printed out essentially just means that our client has connected to our server, because we printed that here whenever we have a connection. And if I refresh my page, it's going to reprint out here. And that's just because we're making a new connection. Every time you render the page, it's a brand new connection. Now, before we get too much further, you're probably already noticing one slight problem with our code, and that's that we hard-coded localhost 1234 into our code. But when we push this up to production, we're not running on localhost anymore, so we need a different origin URL here. Same thing inside of here. We hard-coded our localhost into this environment, but we aren't actually accessing this from localhost always. When we push to production, it's going to be a different URL. So we need to make sure we can dynamically choose our URL based on if we're in production or if we're in development. So let's first do this on the server side, because this is actually going to be fairly straightforward to do. Generally, when you run a server on some hosting platform such as Heroku, it's going to give to you an environment variable, which is called node env. And this is going to be set to production when you're running on a production instance. So what we can do is we can determine if we are running on production, and just by checking that environment variable called node env. If that is equal to production, then that means we are running a production site. And right now, locally, we're not setting this node env to anything. But when you run in production, all you have to do is set it to production, and it's now going to be saying that production is true. And then what we can do is we can get our client URL. So if production is true, we can pass in whatever our production URL is. For example, like realsite.com. It doesn't matter. Whatever your URL is, you put it here. Otherwise, we're going to fall back to our local environment for testing. Then we can just replace our origin with the client URL. And essentially what we've done here is we've just checked, are we in production or development? If we're in production, use this URL. If we're in development, use our local host URL. We can actually do the exact same thing inside of our client because Parcel exposes its own node env. We can see that by just saying console.log process.env.node.env. And if I inspect, you can see it prints out development because we're currently running in development. When we push to a server and run in production, it'll print production. So we can do the exact same trick down here. We can just say const server URL is equal, and we can get our production, which is equal to process.env.node.env. Set it equal production, just like that. And then if it is production, then we can, realsite.com or whatever our site is called. Otherwise, fall back to localhost 3000. And then here, just replace this with our server URL. So to make sure this works, let's just inspect our page, go to the console. You can see it still prints out our socket. Connected is still true. So we're able to connect successfully to our server, and we're also able to dynamically change our URL depending if we're in production or development. This is really useful since if you hard-coded localhost 3000 and you deploy your site, it's obviously going to be broken. Now, before we get too much further into communicating between the server and the client, I just want to work on some quality of life fixes for the client, because right now, as you can see, our guest button, our ready button, our guest section here, all of those are always visible, and we need to make sure that we hide everything essentially except for the ready button until we actually start the round, until everybody readies up. Also, we need to make sure that we have a room and a name in the URL, because if we don't, clearly someone got to this page by accident, and we need to send them back to the home page where they can actually sign up. Let me just close out of this old version of the site. bring this over. So we have our version of the site. And what I want to do is I want to get the room ID and the name from the URL. So to do that, all we need to do is get our URL params. We can get that by using an object called URL search params and just pass it in the URL. We can do that by accessing window.location. This passes the current URL, and we can get the search portion of that, which is just everything from the question mark onwards. This URL params is then going to give us an object, which we can get the name and the room ID from. So we can say our name is URL params.get name, and that's just because up here in our URL, this is called name. And then we want to get our room ID, which in our URL is called room-ID. Now let's just do a quick console log of our name and our room ID. And if we just inspect our page, from the console, you can see our name is name and our room ID is test. And if we check our URL, room ID is test and name is name. So this is working successfully. All we need to do is set up a simple if check to make sure we have a name and room ID, otherwise redirect back to the home page. So if, for example, we do not have a name or we do not have a room ID, if this happens, either of these happens, we just want to take the window.location. We want to set it to index.html. All that this does is redirect us back to the home page. So if I remove name from the URL, hit enter, you can see it redirected us back to the home page because this check failed. So it's doing that redirect right here. Now, if I just type in a room, test, for example, give us a name, Bob, hit join, you can see that it successfully joined and our name and room ID are properly put in the URL. So now our next step, essentially, we just want to select all these different elements that we're using on our page, all the different buttons, the canvas and everything, and get access to them right here inside of our code. So to do that, we'll go to our room HTML and look at everything we need to get access to. We need to get access to our canvas. So we're just going to call this data canvas. We need to get access here to the word that shows up at the top of the screen for the guesser. Call it data word. We need to get access to the list of all the messages that appears on the side of the screen. Call it data messages. We also need to get access to this form. So this is just data guess form. We need access to the input. So data guess input. And finally, our ready button is super important. So we're going to get data ready button, just like that. That should be pretty much everything we need to access. So inside of our JavaScript, let's just get access to all of these. So we're going to get access to our form, which is document query selector. And this is just going to be for data guess form. Copy this down a bunch of times because we're going to get our guess input. We're going to get our word element. We're going to get our messages. Messages element. And we're going to get our ready button. And finally, our canvas. And let's just make sure this is guess input. This one here is just called data word, data messages. This is data ready button. And finally, data canvas. So this is a selector for all the elements that we're essentially going to use on our page. So now the next thing to do is essentially hide everything except for the ready button. So we can just create a function, and we're going to call this function end round. And the reason we're calling this end round is because at the end of every round, we want to reset everything so that the only thing visible is the ready button. And in here, essentially, we just want to hide our form, and we want to hide our word element so that it's not visible up here. So let's create a function called hide, where we pass it an element, in our case, our guess form. Down here, function hide takes an element, and we can just say element.classList.add, and there's a class called hide, which is essentially going to hide any element on the screen. So if we call end form, we'll just do it up here, end form, and save, I'm sorry, not end form, end round, and save, you can see our guess form has immediately hidden itself. So now we essentially have our page set up and ready to go. We can't do any drawing, and all we have is this ready button that right now doesn't do anything. So the next step is obviously going to be connecting with our server. We need to communicate information from our client to our server. And by far the most important thing that we can communicate right now is that the user just connected to the page. We need to tell them what room they're in, and we also need to tell them what their name is. So in order to communicate from the server to the client and from the client to the server, we can use these socket objects. And if we just come over here, we can go down to client, actually down to events, and this is where we can emit our different events. So let's just go down to events and click on emitting events. And we can see here is where we can do it for the server side as well as for the client side. So this is for basic emitting of events. And down here, this is how we communicate with the client. So I'm sorry, we communicate from the client to the server. So if we say socket.emit on our server, pass it in the name of an event and some data, up here we can just listen for that event and we're going to get our data. So what I want to do is just communicate that we've joined a room, because in socket.io, we check down here, there's this thing called the rooms, and it allows us to communicate to people that are only in a certain room. So you can see these two sockets are in a room together, so we communicate with just those people. That way, if I'm drawing on my screen in room test, people in room test 2 aren't going to get my drawings. Only the people in the room test will actually get these drawings. That's what this concept of rooms is for. So the first event that we want to send off from our client to our server is telling them what our name is and what room we joined. So in our case, our name is Bob and the room we joined is test. So to do that, it's very simple. We just say socket.emit and then we give it a name, any name you want. We're going to call it join room. Then we need to pass it data. In our case, I'm going to use an object as our data. I find it easier to work with. So we can have name here is name and room ID is room ID. There we go. So now we're passing an event called join room to our server and we're getting in a name and a room ID. So now if we go over to our server, in here, we can say socket.on join room. We're going to get some data. So if I just console.log our data, you can see if I refresh our page, it's going to connect and it says our name is Bob and our room ID is test. I'll just make this a little bit wider so we can see it. And there we go. That's our data right there. So we successfully communicated from our client to our server. And if we were to go back here and change our name to Bob the Builder, for example, hit enter, you can see our name's here and our room is there. So we've successfully essentially connected from our client to our server and we sent it data saying, here's the room I want to join and here's my name. Now we just need to process that information. Now for our use case, what I want to do is just store the room information inside of memory. So we can say const rooms is equal to an object, because we're going to have the ID of the room essentially be the key for the object. So our rooms are stored in memory, which means every time our server resets, so when we save, our server restarts itself, it clears out our room's memory. It's perfectly fine for our use case that this happens, because if your server resets, it's okay that people lose their room information and have to rejoin. And that's just because we don't want to deal with databases or anything crazy like that for this project. So just in-memory storage is perfectly fine. So now down here where we're joining, I essentially want to create or join into that room. So I want to first create a user. And this user, I want to make sure it has an ID. Luckily, socket.io has an ID on each one of their sockets. So we can just say socket ID to get a unique ID. And I want to get their name from that data name property. And then lastly, I just want to store the socket that this user is using to connect with on the user, just because it'll be easy to reference later on if we need to do something with their socket. Next, I want to create a room, and this is going to come from that rooms array. I just want to check to see if we have a room at data room ID. So this is just saying, get me the room of this current ID. So if we had a room with the ID of test, just like this, and this was our room information inside of here, so this would get us this room if our room ID was test. So essentially here, we're trying to get a room, and if for some reason we don't have a room, so if room is equal to null, then what I want to do is I want to create a room where the users is just an empty array, and I want to get the ID, which is data.roomID. Then take our rooms, take the room ID here, and set our room to that. So essentially we're just trying to get a room, and if we can't find it, we're creating a new one and putting it in the place where it would have been. That's all this code is doing. Then down here, I want to add our user to the room, so we can say room.users.push our user, because we have an empty array of users by default, and if there's already users in there, this will just push them to the end. Also, I want to make sure I join the room. So in socket.io, you can see here I can just say socket.join, and it's going to join me into a room. Then I can send messages to that room, and only the people in that room are going to get it. So I can say socket.join room.id, and this is going to join the room of the ID that we just sent up. Now the very last thing I want to do in here is just a simple console.log of rooms, actually just the room that we're in. Click save, and now if I refresh over here, you can see it prints out our room, and it has an array of users, as you can see here, and an ID of test, and our name is Bob the Builder. So we successfully added our user to our room. We got the ID from Socket.io, we got the ID of the room we're in, but if I refresh my page, you're going to notice an issue. We now have 2 users in our room. Both of them have the same name because that's what our name is, but you can see they have different IDs. One is our original user, and one is our new user. And what's happening is when we disconnect and reconnect, we're never removing ourselves from the room. We're still in the room. So if I refresh a bunch of times here, scroll down, you're going to see our room has tons and tons of users because I refreshed a bunch of time, even though in reality, there's only one person actively connected to the room. So all we need to do is listen for when we disconnect. Luckily, Socket.io takes care of this for us. We can just say socket.on disconnect. Disconnect, and this is going to be a function here, and inside of here all we need to do is just remove ourselves from the room. So we can say room.users, since we already have access to our room. Actually, let me make sure I put this disconnect inside of our onJoin. That way we have access to this room variable right here. So we can take our room.users, and all we want to do is filter them, and just want to filter where our user is not equal to the user that we currently have right here. So what this code essentially does is it takes all of the users and keeps them unless they're equal to the user we currently are, because if we disconnect, we want to remove ourselves. Now if I save this, scroll down to the bottom here, and I refresh our page, you'll see we have 1 user in our room. If I refresh again, we still have 1 user, and it's a different user. As you can see up here, we have the ID 2W, here our ID is UB, so it's properly getting rid of the old user and keeping the new user. No matter how many times I refresh, we're only going to have 1 user inside of our room. So we can kind of get rid of that console log for now since we've taken care of this. So at this point, you're probably thinking like, holy crap, Kyle, we've talked a bunch and we haven't actually done anything yet. I mean, we've written a lot of code and so far our screen is not able to be interacted with. Our ready button doesn't do anything. Literally nothing at all works. And the reason that we've done all this background code is because we really need to be able to connect our server and our client. It's super important. Our app can't work without it. You could build the client side first and then build the connectivity in later. I just find it harder to build out the client first and then try to shove the server in, because generally you wrote your code in a way that makes it difficult to add the server component in. That's why I like to do the server and client connection first. That way when I build out my client and making everything work, it's much easier to actually add in the server components. So finally, we can work on getting our ready button actually doing something. So let's just add an event listener for it. What we can do just down here a little ways, we can just say ready button.add event listener. We want to add it on click. And all we want to do is just send an event to our server. We essentially just want to say that we are ready. So we're going to emit an event called ready. We don't even need to send any information because our socket already knows what user we are. Also, when we click the ready button, I want to hide the ready button just because if we click it, we don't want to be able to click it multiple times. I only want to be able to click it once. So let's save that. Nothing really changes over here, but when I click this ready, you're going to notice the ready button disappears, which is great. That's exactly what we want. I'm going to refresh this so we can have our ready button back to work with. But over on our server, we can now listen to that event. So down here, let's just say socket.on ready. So now we're listening to the ready event for that user. And it's not taking in any data, but whenever we hear this ready event, we need to work on some code. So straightforward, the first thing we need to do is say our user is ready. So we can just say user.ready equals true. We've now said that our user is ready. But what does this ready variable even do? Right now, it doesn't do anything. Essentially, we need to make sure we wait for all of our users to click the ready button before we start. So if we set user.ready to true, we can then check to see if every single user in the room is ready. Let's start the game. So we can just come in here. We can say if room.users.every, and we can say if all of them are ready, then we return true. So if they're all ready, then we just want to start the game. So we need to create a word, we need to choose who is going to draw it, and we need to tell the people to start the game. So before we write any of that code, I want to take a step back and think about what happens when we actually start the game. We choose one person in the group to be the person that draws, and then we choose everyone else to be a guesser, because in Pictionary, one person draws something and the other people are all trying to guess it. And the first one to guess it is going to be the winner, at least in our version of the game. So we probably want to send 2 different events. We want to send one event to the person who is drawing and tell them what the word is, And then we want to send a second event to everyone else that's guessing, and this won't include the word. It'll just tell them, hey, get ready to start guessing. This person is starting to draw. So let's kind of do that. I want to first choose a guesser, and I also want to choose a random word. So let's start with the guesser first. Let's just create a function called get random entry, and this is going to be from an array. And this is just so we can get a random user from an array, but we also need to get a random word from an array. So it's easy to just share this between a function. So in here, what I want to do is I want to take our array.length, and I want to multiply this by math.random. This is essentially going to give us a random number between 0 and 1 minus the length of our array. And it's going to be a decimal though. So we need to first convert this here with the floor down to a whole number. So this is going to give us either, if our array length is 2, for example, this will give us either 0 or 1. Then we can just return accessing this on the array. So we're going to access this as an index. This is a little bit confusing code, but essentially all we're doing, getting a random number between 0 and 1, multiplying it by the length of our array. So in our case, 2, this would give us this number between 0 and 1.999999999. It'll never quite be 2. It'll always be slightly less. Then we're just rounding down. So we're either rounding down to 0 or down to 1, and we're getting the element at that index. So up here, we can just say that our guesser is going to be this person that we get from a random entry. And I just want to set the guesser on the room. So we can say room.guesser is equal to get random entry of our room.users. This is going to get a random user from our room and set it as the guesser. Next thing to do is to set our word. And this is going to be a random entry from some words array. I'm just going to capitalize this because we're just going to hard code some words up here. You could expand this to use an API or dictionary or something, but I'm just going to hard code a few words for our purposes. We'll put dog up here, we'll put bike, and we'll put human. These are our 3 different words that we can use. Obviously not a very fun Pictionary game with 3 words, but this can easily be expanded at any point. So we're getting a random word and a random guesser. Now comes a little bit of the confusing part. We need to send a message to just the guesser that tells them, hey, start drawing. And we also need to send a message to everyone that's not the guesser and tell them, hey, start guessing. So luckily, Socket.io has a really handy way of doing this. If I just come over here, and if I just scroll down a little ways, we're eventually going to get to a section right here, which is called default room. Each socket in Socket.io is identified by a random unique ID. We've already looked at that, the ID of the socket. And luckily, each socket joins its own room. So we can see here, we're sending a message to the ID of a socket. And the reason that this works is because every socket, when they initialize, they join their own room. We can actually see this if we just scroll up here and we console.log our socket.rooms. And we also do our socket.id. So if I just refresh our page over here, you're going to notice that we have a set which contains this ID that's underscore TQX and our test room that we added it to manually. And our ID is underscore TQX. So each socket is in a room, which is the same as its own ID, which is really nice because if you want to send a message to just one socket, you just send it to the ID of that socket and it'll send it to that one person. So what we can do down here is just say IO, which is how we send a message generally to everyone. But we want to send it to one room, and that room is just going to be our guessers, so our room.guesser.id. We're sending a single message to the socket that contains just our guesser. And the message we want to send them, with we just say emit, we're going to send a message which just says like start drawer, for example. And we also need to tell them the word. So we can pass in our room.word. So we're just telling them, hey, one person, whoever's the guesser, start drawing, here's your word. Then what we can do is send a message out to everyone else except for the guesser. So to do that, what we can do is right here. You can see in this drawing, this socket in the bold is the one that's sending the message, and it's only being sent between this socket and this client, not between itself. And the reason that works is because if you call socket with an individual socket and tell it to broadcast to a room, it's going to emit to everyone in that room except for the person sending it. If we used io.to, it's going to send it to everyone, period, in the room. But if we send it from one socket to everyone else, it doesn't send it to the person who sent the message. So we can say room.guesser.socket, and we can go to our room.id here. So we're sending a message from our guesser to everyone else, and it won't send it to itself. And we want to tell them, hey, start guesser. And there we go. This is all the code we need to get up and running with our word, our guesser, and to tell them both to start in their own way. So with all that done, let's just kind of minimize this out of the way, go back to our client, and what I want to do is I want to set up more sockets to listen to. So we can just say socket.on, and we can have start drawer, and we can have a socket on for start guesser, and each one of these just takes a function. So we're going to call a function called start round drawer and start round guesser. And we can define those functions. Let's just do them down here. Start round drawer. And this, remember, takes in our word. And then we have a function start round. And this is for our guesser. And this doesn't take in any words. So here in our start round for our drawer, all we need to do is take our word element, take the inner text, and set it equal to our word. Then for starting the round of our guesser, we just need to make sure that we make this guess form visible. So let's just create a show function, which is going to be exactly the same as our hide function. It's just going to remove the hide class. And we can show our guess form. And the reason we're doing this is because we want to make sure we show the people that are guessing the form, but we don't want to show that to the people that are drawing. Now, if we go over to our actual application, expand this out a little bit, and I click on ready, you can see that we got a random word assigned to us, which in our case is human, the ready button disappeared, and the guess form did not show up. And that's because right now we're the only one in this room. So of course, when we clicked ready, it started. If we have multiple people in the room, so for example, we have a new person, we're going to call them Bobby. Is that going to be their name? We click ready here, nothing happens. We click ready here, you can now see this person is the guesser, since we can guess down here, and this person has the word bike. So it properly selected a random person, gave them a random word, and everyone else is assigned to the guessing role. So now again, we're essentially stuck in a location where we have two paths to go. The first path is to be able to make it so that we can actually do our drawing. So if I just ready both these guys up again since it reset, I can do the implementation for the drawer, and I can make it so they can draw. Second thing I could do is make it so that guessing works. In my case, I think drawing is much more fun, and we've done some kind of boring stuff so far, so I'm going to work on the draw implementation. And since I don't want to pollute this code, right now we already have quite a bit of code showing up in this file, and it's only going to get larger. I want to create a separate file for all of our draw-related functionality. So let's just create a new file, and I'm going to call this here drawablecanvas.js. And I'm using capitals for a reason, because I actually want this to be an object that I initialize with the new keyword. So if you remember from how we use the new keyword, we just create a function, give it a name, in our case, drawable canvas. And here we need to take in the elements that we pass into the constructor, essentially when we call new. In our case, I want to have access to our canvas and our socket because I want to be able to draw on the canvas and I want to be able to emit messages when we draw. Because when we draw a line, we need to tell the other server that we drew a line so that way we can communicate to all the people guessing so they can see what we draw. Because if we draw it on our screen and don't tell anyone, it's pretty hard for them to guess. Now, another thing that you may remember is that when we set things such as this dot canvas equals canvas, this object that's called this gets automatically returned, and that's what we have access to. So if we just come down here and say d equals a new drawable canvas, and we pass it in a canvas, we'll just say t and s here. If we say d.canvas, that is going to be this variable here that we pass in our case, t. We would normally pass in the actual canvas. This is just to show you what this looks like. But we can create private variables, essentially variables that cannot be accessed anywhere but inside of this function. So if we say, for example, let, w equal test. Now, if I come down here and I say d.w, this does not exist. There is no d.w because it's not publicly available since it's not on this object right here. I just defined it as a normal variable. I didn't define it with the this keyword. This is really useful because you can make sure that you only expose the parts of the function that you actually want to be publicly available, makes it easier to use things, as well as makes it harder for people to break your stuff. So let's just clean all of this up. And I actually don't need to add canvas on this because we're not going to be accessing the canvas outside of our drawable canvas. The reason I create this drawable canvas is to hide our canvas and make it so that we can only do a few select things. So inside of here, I essentially want to set up event listeners for how we can draw on our canvas. And a really easy way to do that is if I just say canvas.add event listener, and I want to do it on mouse move, It's going to take in an event. And a nice thing about this mouse move event is it has something called buttons. So if e.buttons is not equal to 1, that essentially means that we're not using the left click to draw. Because if buttons equals 1, then that means we're holding down the left mouse button. So if it's not equal to 1, we're clearly not holding down the mouse button, and we can just return. The next thing we want to do is when we move our mouse, we're moving it from one position to another. So I want to get that new position that we're moving to. So I can say new position is equal to x, and here we want to get something called layer x. This layer x is essentially the x position within the element that we're inside of. So as you can see, our canvas is slightly inset from the edge of our page. So if we did something like page x or client x, this is going to be the distance from this top left corner. If we do layer x though, this actually gives us the position from the top left corner of our canvas, which is really useful so that our drawing is exactly where our mouse is. Because if we want to put something at pixel 20 on our canvas, we want that to be in relation to our canvas, not our screen. So let's get our y as well, e.layer y, and that's our new position. Now we just need an old position to compare this to. So let's default a old position. We're going to call it previous position. We're just going to set it to null by default. And here, we just want to check to see if we have a previous position. So if previous position is not equal to null, then we do some code. And then at the very end here, we want to take our new position and set it to our previous position. And here, if we ever let go of our mouse button, we also want to set our previous position to null. Because if we let go of our mouse button, we stopped drawing, so we want to essentially reset our previous position. What this code does is when we move our mouse with the left mouse button not held down, so no mouse button held down, is it'll just constantly set our previous position to null. We hold down left mouse and move. What's going to happen is the first time we move our mouse, previous position is going to be null. So we're going to create a new position and just skip down here and set it to our previous position. Then the second time we move our mouse, it's going to have previous position already set, and we're going to have a new position, so we can actually draw a line between those positions. So I can say draw a line, which is a function we're going to create. I'll pass it our previous position and our new position. Now this is where the code is going to get a little bit tricky. We can create that draw line function, which takes a start and an end position. And inside of here, in order to draw with canvas, you need to get access to something called the context. So we can get the context, which is just canvas.getContext. We want to get the two-dimensional context because we're drawing in 2D. Then we need to tell our context that we want to begin drawing. So we're going to begin a path. And essentially the way canvas works is we need to tell our element to move to a position, and then we need to tell it to draw a line to a position. So we want to move to our start location. So context.move to start.x and start.y. And then we want to draw a line that's going to go to our end.x and our end.y. Then to tell canvas to actually finalize and draw this, we can just say context.stroke. That is going to draw a stroke between these positions. So if I save this, at first nothing's going to happen because we aren't initializing this drawable canvas anywhere. But if I come over into our room.js, I import our drawable canvas from /drawable canvas, and down here I create a drawable canvas, which is equal to new drawable canvas. I'm going to pass in the canvas and the socket. Now we can actually draw on our canvas. And if I save and click, of course, you're going to notice nothing happens right away. So let's inspect to see if we have any errors. I'm sure we do. And of course, type error canvas.default is not a constructor, blah, 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 blah. So let's see what our error is. The problem is because if we go to drawable canvas, we're not actually exporting anything from here. We need to make sure we export default this. Now, hopefully, no errors. We should be able to draw on our canvas. And you're going to notice something interesting. Our canvas doesn't quite work. It's kind of off on the mouse position. As you can see, the further away I get, the further my line is from my mouse position. This is because canvas is really weird when it comes to scaling. You're supposed to set a width and a height on your HTML canvas element. So right here, we're supposed to set a width equal to something and a height equal to something. But right now, the width and height of my canvas is controlled via CSS. As I expand my page, you can see that it's changing with the CSS of our page. So what I want to do is I want to automatically set the width and height on our canvas element to the width and height it currently is at every single time we resize our page. So to do that, back into the room.js we go. We need to set up an event listener for whenever our room size changes, or our window size. We can say window.addEventListener on resize, and this is going to come in here, and all we need to do is resize our canvas. So let's just actually create a function called resize canvas. Then we can move down and actually create that function, resize canvas. And all this function is going to do is take our canvas.width, and we're going to set it to null. And then we're going to take our canvas.height, and we're going to set it to null. The reason we do this is we want to reset our width and height so that the CSS can take over before we determine our client dimensions. So we can get our const client dimensions, which is equal to canvas.getBounding client rect, whoops, just like that. And the reason we set width and height to null beforehand is because down here, we're going to set our client canvas width to our client width and our canvas, canvas.height to our client height. And if we don't set our width and height to null here, when we get our dimensions, it's just going to pull the dimensions from the ones already set on the canvas. We want it to reset to the current size in CSS before we get the new dimensions. Now, all we need to do is just make sure that we call this function right away. So that way we automatically resize our canvas first, and then anytime we ever change our window size, we again resize it. Now, if we draw, you're going to notice the line draws exactly where my cursor is, which is perfect. That's exactly what we want. And when I let go, move around, draw again, that works perfectly. But one issue you'll notice is if we go out of bounds and come back in bounds, you see it draws a line between these 2 points. That's not quite what we want. I actually want to, in our drawable canvas, make sure we take into account that. So let's just collapse this and create a new event listener for mouse leave. This is whenever we leave the canvas. And all I want to do here is I want to take our previous position and set it equal to null. Now, if I'm drawing and I go out of the canvas, come back in, you can see it doesn't draw that line between these 2 locations because I'm resetting my previous position whenever I leave the canvas. So now the next step is just to make sure we submit this to everyone else, because if we look over here, none of our drawings are actually showing up. If we draw over here, it doesn't show up over here. If we draw over here, it doesn't show up over here. So we need to make sure we communicate between our different clients. To do that, we of course need to use sockets. So we can emit an event, and we're just going to call this a draw event. And this is going to take in our previous position. We'll just call this start, and it's going to take in our end position, which we're just going to call end, which is our new position. So we pass up our start and our end location. Now inside of our server, we can listen for this. So inside of here, we can say socket.onDraw. We're going to take in some data. And all I want to do is emit back. So I can say socket.toRoom.id. I want to emit, and this emit is just going to be called draw line. And all I want to do is pass in our start and our data end, just like that. So we're passing down 2 pieces of data. We save that, go back to our drawable canvas. In here, we can listen for that event. So let me just collapse this down again. And we could say here, socket.onDrawLine. All we're going to do is call the draw line function. And this is going to look like it works, even though it technically is not quite going to work. Let's draw. You can see we draw a line, come over here, the exact same line is drawn. But let's say that we resize our canvas to be different. So this canvas size is way different than this one over here. If we draw, you're going to notice these don't quite line up right. As I go down, you can see that this canvas still has plenty of room, but this other one, I'm already off the screen. As you can see that. And I come back up, you can see it's now finally showing again. This clearly doesn't work if you're doing Pictionary because not everyone's going to have the same screen size. So what we need to do is something called normalization. We're essentially going to take our canvas coordinates, which are in, coordinates based on our current canvas size. We need to convert it to a value between 0 and 1. 0 would be top left, 1 would be bottom right. Then when we get our data received on the client, we can essentially convert those values of 0 to 1 down into the actual canvas dimensions. So let me show you exactly how that's going to work. We'll create 2 functions to do this. Our first function is going to be called normalize coordinates, and it's going to take our position, and all I want to do is just convert this to a value between 0 and 1. So I want to turn a new object where the x is just our position.x divided by our canvas.width. And our y is going to be the exact same thing, but it's going to be for our position y divided by our height. Essentially, all that this does right here is just taking our position x, let's say our position x was 10 and our canvas was 20 pixels wide, divides it by 20, so we're left over with 0.5. That essentially says our dot is halfway across our canvas. That way, no matter how wide or tall or skinny our canvas is on the other element, it's always going to show up properly. This is because we can use this second function, which I'm going to create, and this one's just going to be called toCanvasSpace. I'm going to take in a position. This is a position that's already been normalized, and we want to return our position.x times our canvas, canvas.width, and same exact thing for our y, position.y times canvas.height. So here we're able to convert to a value between 0 and 1, and here we convert from a value of 0 to 1 to our actual canvas dimensions. Then, when we actually send our information inside of here, we want to be able to normalize this. So we're going to send our normalize position value. And here, exact same thing, normalize our position. And then when we receive our event, we're going to be getting a start and an end. And I want to call that draw line function, but I want to make sure that I convert this to canvas space. So we're going to convert our start and our end to canvas space. Now, if I just make sure to ready both of these up and I do a drawing, you're going to see clearly this is not quite what we're looking for. It's pretty cool looking, but clearly there's something wrong with our code. Let's just inspect to see what's happening. It looks like our previous position is never getting reset, and it says reference normalized position is not defined. Looks like I just spelled this incorrectly. It should be normalized coordinates. If I change that, hopefully now we just ready up on both of these and draw. You can see that it's drawing between them, but when I approach the bottom of this canvas and the bottom of the other canvas, they both line up with one another. So now everything is being drawn to scale. Essentially, the top right corner is this canvas is the top right of the other one, and the bottom left of this one is the bottom left of the other one. Now there is one small problem we're running into though, is that the guesser is able to draw on their screen. We clearly don't want the guesser to be able to draw. Only the person that is actually the drawer should be able to draw. So what I want to do is I want to create a variable that's actually accessible by the public. We're going to make this accessible on this object. We're going to call it canDraw. And by default, this is false. And down here, I just want to check to see if the user can draw as well. So if the button is not pressed or they cannot draw, then we want to reset the position and return. This way, only people that have the access and ability to draw can actually draw. And now, if I just ready both these people up and I try to draw, neither of them are able to draw because canDraw is false for both of them. But if I go into the room.js and whenever we start our drawer, I just say here that we want to take our drawable canvas.canDraw and set it to true. And down here, when we end our round, I just want to take our drawable canvas.canDraw and set it to false so that they can't draw after the round is over. Now, if I ready both of them up, you can see whoever the guesser is, they cannot draw, but the drawer is able to draw just fine. So now I'm able to only let the person drawing draw, and the guesser is not able to. So that right there pretty much takes care of everything that there is to do with it. The next step is actually going to be the guessing portion, because right now we can't actually make any guesses. Let me just move this out of the way, come over here, and what we need to do inside of our room is set it up so that we can make a guess. So I just want to do another event listener from when we submit our guess form up here. And actually, since we have quite a few of these, I want to just create a function to group them all. So we can just say function setup button events. Actually, we can just say setup events, just like that. We can actually even just say HTML events. That way we know what they are. And up here, we can call setup HTML events. We can just copy over these events into setup HTML events. Then we can take our guess form and add an event listener for the submit of this form. And just like all other forms, we want to prevent the default so it doesn't refresh our page. And then we can determine if we've actually guessed something based on this guess input. So we just say if guess input dot value is equal to an empty string, just return because we haven't actually guessed anything. So there's no point in trying to send that guess to the server. Otherwise, we want to emit that guess to the server. So we can say make guess, and we're going to make a guess called guess, and it's just going to be our guess input dot value. So it's going to send that information to our server. Next thing we need to do is display that guess on our list, because if we don't display it, we can't actually see it. So display guess. We're going to pass it in the person that made the guess and the guess input dot value. Then finally, at the very end here, I just want to take our input dot value and clear it out. That way it's easier for them to guess multiple times in a row. Now let's create this display guess function real quick. We'll just come down here. We'll just do it right here. Function display guess takes a name and a guess input. And in order to be really clear, we're going to call this guess name, or actually guesser name, just so we know exactly what this is. We don't confuse it with our name variable that's global. And here we're just going to call this guess because it's not actually the input, it is the guess itself. Now to display our guess, luckily we have a really handy here template that we can use for displaying our guess. This just has all the styling already applied to it, and it's called data guess template. So in our room, let's just select that up here. Const guess template equals document dot query selector, and we want to get it for data guess template. Then we can just clone that down here inside of our display guess. So our guess element is equal to guess template dot content dot clone. Content dot clone node, and true because we want to get all the information inside of it. All these extra divs, we want them. So then what we can do is we can get our message element, which here is just our guess element, and we want to get a query selector of, and if we look over here, we have data name and data text. So our text is our message. So we can do data text, and we want to get the name. Make sure I call this message element, and this one is data name. Then all we need to do is name.inner text is equal to name, and it's actually called guesser name. So guesser name, and then our message element dot inner text is equal to here our guess. Make sure that this is name element. And then all we need to do is add this to our message list. So we have our messages element, which is our list of messages. We can just append our guess element to that. A lot of code, but essentially all we did, clone our guess template, add in the message name and text. So we added our guess and our guesser's name, and then we just appended it to the list of our messages. That's all we've done here. And for now, our socket is not actually doing anything on the server side, but let's just see if this works on the client side. So let me just expand this out. Easy to see. Ready up, ready up. I'm going to expand this guy out, and let's just make a guess. Type something in, hit enter. You can see it adds that guess to our list. We can make as many guesses as we want, and if it expands off the top of the screen, they just disappear essentially. That's all that happens. So now that we're actually making guesses, I want to send these guesses to everyone, including the drawer, because right now they're not getting these guesses. So in our server, let's make sure we listen to that event. Let me just expand this out, and we can come down here. We can say socket.on make guess, and we're going to get in data. And all I want to do is just send this guess to everyone. So to everyone inside of our room, I want to send this message. And this message is going to be a guess message, and it's going to take in the name of our user, and it's going to take in the guess, which comes from our data. For now, that's all I'm going to do. I'm not even going to worry about checking for the winner yet, because I first just want to make sure the message gets sent to everyone. So let's save this, go to our room, and actually listen to that. So up here, socket.on make, actually it's just on guess, we want to call the display guess function, because that takes in the name and the guess, which is what we're passing down from our server, the name and the guess. So now, if I just ready up both these people, you can see if we make a guess over here, it gets sent to both people, both our drawer and our other clients, as well as if we had other guesses, it would send it to them as well. Our drawing still works. So really, our application is almost entirely complete. Really, the last step is just to make sure that we actually check to see if the person guessed correctly, and then make sure we reset everything back to a normal state. So to do that, inside of here, we just need to make a check. We can see if the data.guess is equal to the room.word. Now this may seem like all you need to do, but what happens if the word is bike and they type in bike lowercase, or they type in bike with random uppercase letters? We want that to still be correct, because we don't want them to have to guess if the word is capitalized or not. So to get around this, we're just going to convert all of these to lowercase, and we're going to convert this word to lowercase. That way we always have a lowercase word to compare against. Also, I'm just going to trim our guess here. This is going to remove any white space at the beginning or end. That way, if they type in space, 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 bike, space, 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 it'll still be correct because it removes that white space for them. So that's all we need to do here. Last thing we can do is actually make sure we send an event saying that we won, and we need to reset everyone to be not ready. So room.users.forEach user, what we need to do is just say u.ready is equal to false. Also, I want to send an event to everyone, including the person that made the guess. So I want to send an event to the room, and that's going to be to everyone because we're sending it from IO. If we send it from a socket, it sends it to everyone but that socket. And this is just going to be called winner. And let's just pass in the name of the person that won and the actual word so everyone can see what the word was and who the winner was. That's pretty much everything we need for our server. So in our room, let's listen to that event. Socket.onWinner, we're going to call a function, and this function is actually going to be our endRound function. In this endRound function, we already have created it down here. All it does is just say we can't draw and it hides our form, but now I want to also have it take in a name and a word, and these are optional. They're only going to come in sometimes because up here, when we first call endAround, it doesn't have anything. So we just need to check to make sure we have a name and a word before we do anything. So let me just say, if we have a word and we have a name, then what I do is run the code. We set the word element.inner text to the word. This is so everyone can see what the word is. And then we want to make sure we show the word element to everyone because right now it's hidden for a lot of people. Also, I want to display a guess saying who the winner is. So we're going to display a guess that doesn't have a name, but we want to display some text. And this text is essentially going to have their name and to say is the winner. There we go. Now, if I save this, if I ready both people up, I can do some drawing. This is clearly a very good drawing of a human. So let's say they guess human and with some weird capitalizations in there. Let's put some spaces at the end too. Hit guess. You can see it successfully says Bobby is the winner, which is our name. It says it to both people, and it shows us the word human so that we can see the word human. Also, we cannot draw anymore because it turned our can draw to false. So all we need to do now is make sure we reset. So we need to show the ready button again because right now they can't re-ready up. So to do that, let's just move this to the side here. Show the ready button. Okay, now let's see if there's any other cleanup we need to do. Let's ready both people up. Our guess is going to be bike. As you can see, it says Bob the builder is the winner, which is the person's name over here. And we can now ready both people back up. But we ran into another problem. We can even run into another problem. Let's see who the drawer is. This person is. So now if we make a guess of human, you can see everything's working. And when we click ready for both people, the drawing didn't even disappear. It's still there. Also, our word's not disappearing. So there's a lot of stuff we need to make disappear. So let's move up to where we start the round for the drawer. We need to be able to clear our canvas. So let's just create a function called clear canvas on our drawable canvas. We're going to do that for both people. Inside of here, we can just say this dot clear canvas is equal to a function. And unfortunately, it's not as easy as being like canvas dot clear. Canvas is kind of annoying when it comes to this. We need to get access to our context, which is canvas dot get context 2D. And then what we need to do is say context.clearRect. This is going to clear essentially a rectangle, and our rectangle is wanting to be the full size of our canvas. So from 0, 0 to our max width to our max height, this is going to cover our entire canvas and clear everything on it. Now, let's just make sure that that works. Ready everyone up, make a drawing, guess correctly. Now when I click ready, you can see when I click ready on both, it clears the canvas and I can draw again. So that's working properly. Next thing is just to hide this word element. Also, we want to hide all of these old guesses because they don't make sense for the new round. So in our room.js, let's come into here for starting the round with a guesser. And we want to take our word element, inner text, and we're going to set it to an empty string to clear it out. And we're going to hide our word element just like that. Also, I want to clear our messages. So to do that, I can just say messages element dot inner HTML is equal to an empty string, and I'm going to do that for both people. Now, if I save this, we should hopefully have everything done. Let's ready both people up. Let's draw a really beautiful looking human for the final round. Let's guess properly. And you can see it says Bobby is the winner. We'll ready both people up. All the old messages disappear. The words disappear. I can now draw a a really beautiful looking dog over here. And I can guess dog. And you can see that everything is working flawlessly. So that's pretty much everything for our basic version of the Pictionary game, but there's a ton of different ways that you can improve upon this and make it better. One way that I think would be really easy to make this a better game is add the ability for people to choose a custom color for the drawing that they're doing. So when you're drawing right now, it's black, but if you want to put some colors at the top of this section here where they can choose some hard-coded colors or even use a color picker to choose their own color, that'd be a great, easy way to add additional functionality to this. Also, in the same vein, it would be great to be able to select the width of the line that the person's drawing as well. That's another fairly easy change that you can make to this application. Another thing that would be useful is having the ability to erase things. That's a little bit more involved than just the brush size and such, but still not too difficult to do. The final thing that would be useful is making it so that if a room is already in play, like right now we're in play in a game, if someone else tries to join this room, we want to add them either to a waiting list or give them a warning saying that the room is currently in progress, because right now people can join mid-game, which is definitely not what we want. So adding in that, progress room or waiting room or something like that would be a really useful addition. Really, there's a ton of ways that you can improve this by making it more polished, adding more features, and so on. So really, it's up to you what you want to do to improve upon this project. There's an endless amount of possibilities, and whatever you want to learn the most would be the best choice for you.